Mark Twain once said, "Find a job that you love doing and you'll never work a day in your life." And at least to an extent, I am evidence of that. For the past few years, I have worked full-time as a writer, a YouTuber, a book critic, and I wake up every single day feeling lucky, feeling blessed that this is my job, this is what I do. But no matter how much you love your job, no matter how grateful you feel to have that job, you can still get burned out on it, just like we get burned out on our hobbies. In fact, my job and my hobby are basically the same thing. And getting burned out on things that you love is completely normal and not something you should feel guilty about, even though I constantly do. So what do you do if you're feeling burned out? And more specifically, what do you do if you're feeling burned out but you don't want to just step away for a while? If you're feeling burned out on a hobby because you've been doing it too much and you're getting a little bit bored or a little bit tired, you can just stop doing it and go do something else, especially if it's not your job. But what if it is your job, as is my case? And more broadly, what if you just don't want to? What if you don't want to step away? You want to find a way to kind of sidestep. You want to find a way to handle your burnout rather than just step away from it and leave it to the side. And that's what I want to specifically talk about here. How to handle reading burnout without just stopping reading. Recently, I've been struggling with burnout because I've been hiding in a little valley of depression for a bit. And I also read way too many books of one genre, big books too. And now I'm very burned out on that genre and also kind of just burned out on reading in general. But as I said, I don't want to be. So I turned to my patrons for advice. I had a few ideas for what I wanted to do to try and handle my burnout. Some of those ideas were mirrored by my amazing patrons, and others also came up with new and fresh ideas, so I'm going to share them with you. Here's how to handle your reading burnout. The thing I'm currently doing to handle my reading burnout is to read something that is still within that genre that I was getting burned out on, but is entirely different at the same time. This is The Spirit Bares Its Teeth by Andrew Joseph White. I'll talk about it more in an upcoming video, but this is an historical novel, but it's also a horror novel, and it's also a piece of YA fiction. I don't read a lot of YA fiction, and so I decided now is the time, because I'm burned out on heavier, darker, longer, more literary things. I need to read something that is a bit lighter. To my surprise, this actually isn't a light book. It is thematically dense, but it is still curing my reading burnout because I have sidestepped. Rather than just putting reading away, I've turned to a different genre. I've turned to a different style of writing, more specifically. Sidestepping into a different genre is one way to do it, but YA is a specific style of writing, as I've come to realize. And it's really what I needed, and so this is working, this is helping. So switching styles and genres is one way to handle your burnout, and try and sidestep into something that will re-spark your love of reading in a different way. But there are plenty of others. One popular suggestion from my Patreon community was to switch mediums entirely. Go and read some manga or some comic books. Jackie Z said, "I turn to graphic novels when I'm burnt out, and they really help me get back into reading. Sometimes I even read children's picture books, especially picture books about being LGBTQ, which I couldn't access when I was little." Switching mediums is kind of like taking a break from reading. You're taking a break from one particular style of reading and doing something entirely different. Sarah G echoed this and said, "I totally agree about graphic novels when facing burnout. Heartstopper saved my reading career during this last really challenging year." Leslie C said, "I just went through that, so I read a graphic novel and reread a couple of old favorites." Queen of Glitches specifically said, "I find that changing medium helps a lot, since it feels different enough to what caused the burnout." As others have mentioned, comics and graphic novels, manga, these things all massively help us. If you're burned out on reading prose, switch to a different medium. And comics, manga, graphic novels, they are a great alternative. You're still reading, you're still enjoying literature, but it's a very different medium. As a lifelong comic book fan, reading comics often feels like blending literature and film together. In fact, there have been times where I've had a memory pop up in my head of a film I watched or a cartoon I once watched, and I can't remember what it was. And then when I realize what it was, it often turns out it was a comic book that I've kind of turned into a film in my head, which is always really, really fun when it happens. Doing this is making me realize that there's such a difference between genres, mediums, and styles. Switching mediums could mean switching from prose to comics or from prose to poetry. Switching styles might mean switching from adult fiction to YA fiction or from longer novels to novellas and short stories, and then switching genres is fantasy, romance, science fiction, etc. Going back to switching styles, Rachel said, "Young adult and children's books can help me. At the moment, I've been reading more comics, graphic novels, poetry, short stories, and novellas to deal with my burnout." Donnie J said, "For me, I always find short stories are a good way to get back into reading after burnout. Short stories give you an immediate narrative and thematic arc to dig into and chew on without having to put a week or two aside for a novel. That is such a great point. If you love reading, if you enjoy fiction and literature, but burnout means that you don't feel like you have the energy to actually dig into a full-length novel, pick up a short story collection and just read 1 or 2 stories. You get everything you need in terms of themes and characters and story, but it's bite-size. Most short stories can be read in a very small amount of time in one sitting, and there you go, you're done. You kind of got your fill, and it's a great feeling. Plum Jam also echoed the comics and graphic novels thing, saying that they're currently rereading Hellblazer and Sandman, and we're going to come on to rereading in a second. Haley said, "Usually novellas or short story collections, manga or rereading an old favourite works for me." Digging a little bit deeper into the manga and comics thing, Carol Giron said, "I love low-stakes manga, such as Hakame to Michiko and Saint Young Men, which I keep for times of need. When I want to read a novel, I turn to queer romance and cozy mystery books." Kayla Day also echoed the manga thing, saying, "I've only recently started reading manga, so off I go to the library and I just pick one that looks like fun. It reminds me of when I was young and I picked books that I thought looked good without the influence of BookTube. It brings back the fun." Ollie said, "Being autistic, I get burnt out a lot. When I'm lacking the energy, I always turn to manga." Manga, comic books, it feels like going this route is one of the most popular ways of dealing with burnout, and I get it, I echo it, I totally agree with it. As I briefly hinted at, another great way to handle burnout is to return to old favorites, things that you loved from your childhood, or things that you just have a really happy memory of. Jennifer Wilder said, "In this kind of mood, I find that rereading my favorites helps. It's comforting to return to a well-loved world or narrator. It helps if it's something humorous." Pauline echoed that as well and said, "Rereading works for me, especially if I can get them on audiobook," and we will also come to audiobooks in a second. Neil Gaiman and Colleen Doran's books come to mind, but children's books too. It's easy on the word count and the pictures usually lift my spirits a little. That's absolutely lovely. Sarah also said, "Reread books where I know the story well. Very relaxing to know what will happen next. I also choose books with lighter, more feel-good content." Abigail Mitchell said, "Generally, I like to read things that don't necessarily require much critical thinking or reflection, which for me is thrillers." So we've had switching styles from things like adult to YA, or from long fiction to novellas and short stories, and we've had switching mediums from prose to comics, manga, graphic novels, and also rereading old favourites is always a good idea. But there's more. I didn't think of this, but this is such a good idea. Audiobooks. If you're feeling burned out on reading, read with a different sense. Stop holding a book and reading the pages. Go for a walk and listen to an audiobook. Quite a few people suggested this. Celia said, "I would recommend listening to an audiobook of a book that you loved. It means I can enjoy something without requiring a huge amount of focus." So that's combining the two, switching your medium to audiobooks and also still rereading an old favourite. I actually recently read the audiobook of Good Omens, which is an old favourite, and listening to it on audiobook really did feel like a new experience. Tatiana Wong also said, "I will switch to an audiobook." As I've already touched on, when you switch genres, it's a really good idea to switch to something that is low stakes, something like a cozy mystery or a romance novel. Kelly Porter said, "As much as they're full of annoying tropes, I always find a romance book pulls me out of a slump, and I love a cozy village mystery when I feel burnt out." This is kind of what I expected when I started reading a YA book, but it turned out to be a much heftier, thematically dense, and also horror-filled thing than I anticipated, but it has still done the job. Maybe because what I expected to happen kind of carried me through a little bit. I'm not sure, but it worked. And then there's the thing that surprised me the most, a thing that I didn't think about doing at all, but a few of my patrons mentioned, which is switching from fiction to non-fiction. I thought this was such a great idea. Going back to what Tatiana Wong said, sometimes I'll go back to reading some non-fiction if I've been feeling uninspired. And I think uninspired is such a great word to use. Burnout can take different forms, and the way that I've been feeling recently is not necessarily the kind of burnout that everyone feels. You might be feeling uninspired. You might look at your TBR or even your old favourites and go, no, that's not what I want. Switching to non-fiction is almost like switching gears entirely. Like scrolling through Netflix, you don't want to watch any of the films and TV shows whether you've seen them before or not, but suddenly you go, oh, maybe a documentary. That's different. And with reading, it's exactly the same. Go for a non-fiction. This is one that I really enjoyed specifically. Verda Grisel said, I tend to go for non-fiction about medical history of all things. It's a fascinating subject to me that I never seem to get tired of, especially books about advances in the 1800s and 1900s. It's something about the mix of it being gruesome, infuriating, and hopeful that at least some people have always been trying to do the right thing. Also, the petty feuds that took place between Victorian-era doctors is some peak drama. I love that. What a great thing to do. Read non-fiction instead. And specifically something like that, that's really cool. So with the help of my incredible Patreon community, we have provided you with 5 ways to handle your burnout. Try switching genres. If you've been burned out on science fiction, read some romance, for example. And specifically when it comes to genre, read something light, something cozy, something fun. Romance is always a good option, as are cozy mystery books like the works of Agatha Christie. I often turn to her when I'm feeling a bit burned out. Then we have switching styles, like from prose to poetry, or from longer novels to short stories, novellas, etc. Switching mediums entirely is a really great way to make reading feel fresh and different again. Go for some comics, go for some manga. It's an entirely different way of reading. It's an entirely different way of enjoying entertainment in general. Then there's rereading your old favourites, finding something that brings you comfort, something nostalgic, something that won't surprise you because you already know what's going to happen. You can read it at your own pace, you know how it's going to go. It's like coming home, and it feels wonderful. I'm going to do it soon with a very important favourite of mine. And finally, we have switching to non-fiction. It's something that I really didn't think of at all, and I'm so pleasantly surprised by that. Go for non-fiction. You're reading for a very different purpose. I guess that's why it helps so much. And it probably works the other way too. If you mostly read non-fiction, reading a novel will feel like an enormous break from reading so much non-fiction. They serve different purposes. You're still reading, but for a different reason. And that's really cool. So if you're feeling burned out, hopefully one of these 5 ways of handling your burnout can help you handle your burnout. Thanks to the advice of my patrons, I kind of feel a lot more equipped to deal with burnout now. I'm definitely going to be rereading an old favourite soon, and that was also suggested by my Patreon community, and if you want to be a part of this community, you can support me on Patreon. I would really appreciate your help, and you'll get to give plenty of input in videos like this one. So check out my Patreon if you're interested, and subscribe for books.